So next we're going to hear from Charlissa Moore. Charlissa is an assistant professor at James Madison College in the College of Engineering in international energy policy. And I think she's going to talk to us. She's developing research collaborations in the College of Engineering to study the social and governance aspects of emerging technologies. So Charlissa, you're ready. That's great. So this is going to be interesting, I think, because again, we're looking at one of the other aspects of this, which is liability and regulation. So,
great.
Which one?
Thank you. All right, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for having me today. I have my primary appointment in James Madison College, which is our public policy school for undergraduate students. So my goal there is to bring issues of technology and technological systems and governance of technology to public policy students. And then I have a secondary appointment in civil and environmental engineering, even though I'm a social scientist, to bring issues of social science, public policy, regulation into energy infrastructure projects that are being designed in the College of Engineering. So that's my overall role. I study energy systems. I'm actually new to autonomous vehicles, but just getting into this, and so I'll summarize my preliminary findings so far. So I'll talk a little bit about some of the different ethical scenarios that are being presented and how those might influence public opinion. I'll talk a little bit about the key issues in liability and some other potential issues with risk, and give a brief overview of the current sort of strange regulatory environment on autonomous vehicles. Let me see if I can get my URL to work. So there are some interesting scenarios that have been discussed where you have a sort of lesser of two evil scenarios with accidents. So there's inevitable an accident. So what should the software be programmed to do? So this is a website that goes through with a sort of bird's eye view, not making the decision as the driver, but trying to figure out who do you value more from your ethical system. So in this case, do you hit this group of people here, or do you hit that group of people there? So let's choose them. In this case, there are some people here who are larger versus some people who are more fit. So do you have a sort of implicit bias there? In this one, there are 2 passengers and there are 2 pedestrians. So would you decide to run into the 2 pedestrians, or would you sacrifice the people in the car? Skip through this. So then they have some where you can kind of tell what the occupation is of the people. So would you be less likely to run into somebody who is a doctor, for instance, an older person, and so forth. So there's some, it's not coming up, where there's somebody who's stereotyped as a bank robber. So would you be more likely to hit a grouping of bank robbers? So get my PowerPoint back. So some of the questions are, should the driver and passenger be sacrificed, and should different decisions be made perhaps if there are children on board? Would you end up hitting an old woman rather than a young girl? And if you program a car to do this, are you essentially programming ageism into the car? What about hitting a motorcyclist who is wearing a helmet rather than one who is not, because the motorcyclist who is wearing the helmet is more likely to survive the crash? And does that then incentivize motorcyclists to not wear helmets? What about hitting a motorcyclist instead of choosing to sacrifice the driver because the driver is more likely to survive than the motorcyclist? What happens if the car swerves to hit a deer and inadvertently hits people? And what happens if it swerves to avoid a toddler and ends up hitting more people instead, 3 people? So drivers typically make these kind of decisions in the panic of the moment, but it's possible the courts would be less forgiving of the programmer of the software choosing these issues, deciding these. So maybe they did so unintentionally, but then they could be found to be negligent for not really thinking through the risks. Or maybe they did so intentionally, and this could later be viewed as wrongful death. So ethicists would have sort of a black and white, right versus wrong thing to say on this typically. And a lot of people in the ethics community are now saying this is not appropriate. These issues are a lot more complex. So they're starting to look into what's been called experimental morality. So let's instead ask people and have sort of a reasonable person standard to ask them, what's your gut check? What do you think should be done? So the principle of ethics that's usually applied here would be utilitarian. So just basically prioritizing leading to the death of the fewest number of people instead of making those decisions about old versus young, et cetera. And so some researchers have studied this and found that most people are comfortable with programming utilitarian ethics into cars, but the paradox is that while people favor cars that might sacrifice the driver, they don't want to drive them. So this is going to have to be an issue that we address. It could become a very politicized issue and could sway public opinion. So what are the resulting liability issues that would stem from this? So some of the issues are product liability law, where it could be seen as basically a design flaw of the software to make these difficult decisions. This may end up not relating to strict liability, but basically to ordinary negligence. And it's tricky because it might make sense for somebody to say, I have a reasonable $100,000 claim for medical bills and loss of work, and under reasonable law, under the reasonable man standard, you should pay for that. But companies are going to be very reticent to settle in a case like that because it could set a precedent. So you end up settling on the first one and then setting a precedent and losing them all. Under ordinary negligence, as I understand it, the injured party actually does not have direct action. They cannot directly sue the manufacturer. But what happens is that the driver who caused the accident or whose car caused the accident could end up suing the manufacturer under indemnification and saying, well, I think I was half responsible and I think you were half responsible, so I pay $50,000 and then you pay $50,000. But again, these upfront cases are really important because you have the possibility to set a precedent. The jurisdiction for this product liability law is mostly state law, not federal. So you have this problem that's been mentioned before with the patchwork of different laws. And there's the question that if an accident actually was inevitable, then does this actually just absolve the manufacturer of negligence? And it's just not clear yet. Another thing that's been discussed is that under consumer protection laws, some states might actually allow families to sue the car that sacrificed the driver. Another question that's been asked is if the driver gets to program in the moral algorithm and say, I don't want the car to sacrifice me, or I choose utilitarian ethics for the car, then maybe that helps to absolve the manufacturer of negligence. But then you have these jerks who say, I don't want to, I'd rather not drive off the cliff and hit the car full of, or the bus full of school children instead, and that's sort of disturbing. So right now we have this set of risks around driving that are quite remarkable. I think there were 35 or 40,000 people killed on the road last year, and we've just become habituated to them. There are also a number of inconveniences, like filling up your car with gas, that we've become habituated to. So auto accidents right now usually just appear on the front page, or on the pages of the obituaries, and we know from this weekend that any sort of autonomous vehicle accident ends up being on the front pages. So how do we kind of get ahead of this before you have those inflammatory cases of public opinion? And one example that's been given in this area is the Ford Pinto, where there was this inflammatory jury trial. There were these pictures of these people who had been badly burned, and then it was painted as, well, if Ford had just paid $11 more per car for this extra part, then this never would have happened. So the company ended up looking callous. So if administrative agencies decline to establish safety requirements for automated vehicles, they're merely leaving this task to judges and juries after the incidents have occurred. And so after 15 to 20 jury findings, they're going to keep appealing this, and at some point the Supreme Court is basically going to have to decide on these issues. But the issues don't really end there, so we need to also consider liability issues associated with accidents with connected vehicles, where the vehicles are interacting, who ends up being liable there, accidents where there might be interacting technological and human components. So right now a lot of the law has gone toward, as you heard earlier, making it very easy for the driver to take control over the vehicle. So then how do you figure out in court what part was caused by the technology, if any, and what part was human error? I've also been talking to some colleagues in computer science who say that it's not going to be particularly difficult for terrorists to be able to spoof the sensors on the car. So you have the potential, right now we look at terrorism accidents on mass transit, but you might have the potential to have a terrorism incident with individual vehicles as well. So we need to think about how we might, how companies might end up writing insurance policies for this. And the state regulatory body, the insurance commissions, will basically need to improve and put in place new policies. So they might need to approve terrorism insurance for vehicles, which is not something we've had before, obviously. And it probably needs to end up working in a no-fault insurance way so that the driver themselves goes to the insurance and says, okay, I get a reasonable amount for medical bills and maybe pain and suffering on top of that, but otherwise it's pretty hard to see how that liability is going to be parsed out. It's also interesting to consider that the insurance companies might be willing to start to take these steps and figure this out because most of their claims are small rear end collisions. And so they actually, all of those collisions are caused because people just weren't paying attention. So they do actually have an incentive to figure this out and to reduce those claims. So some other type of risks, labor market risks have been mentioned already. So automation taking away jobs has been a very politicized issue in this last election. How do we deal with issues of crime? So one issue that's come up is how to police crime on the little pods that might travel through the suburbs, picking people up for work, so kind of semi-public transportation. How would you police something like sexual assault on that, which is currently a major issue on public transportation? There's an opportunity for hacking the vehicle, so targeted attacks against particular individuals, and for what I understand from computer science colleagues, a lot more potential for grand theft auto as you start to have the phone that's hooked up to the internet hooked into the infotainment system. So those issues also relate to privacy, so hacking into the phone that's connected to the internet. Also new forms of advertising, so what happens when your car starts to drive you past particular businesses so that it can advertise to you, and how do we kind of regulate that? And there's a potential for a lot of personal data to be collected. The other point that's been made on this is that consumers tend to prioritize convenience. So with these privacy issues, where you need something like two-factor authentication, when the company wants to sell cars and the customer is the main inconvenience, that's potentially going to be a public education issue. So next, issues of risk and public opinion. So are consumers going to adopt this? Will they adopt a car that's programmed to sacrifice the driver for utilitarian ethics purposes? And so they assess risk, the way that it would be looked at by researchers is pretty different from the perceived risk, the way that the public looks at the risk. And there's an issue right now with trust in experts. So it's important to remember that the public's going to look at this in a way that is not necessarily what we would consider to be rational. And then there are likely to be a number of unintended consequences. One of the kind of interesting one that's been brought up is that if you have way fewer car accidents, you also have way fewer organ donors. So there's also the question of overall cost benefit. So again, we become habituated to a set of risks and problems and inconveniences with our current mobility infrastructure. And so how does this really compare to what we have right now? And how can we become kind of habituated to new risks if the overall cost benefit is better? But again, this is not how the public views risk. So right now the regulatory environment for autonomous vehicles is fairly strange, and there's a patchwork of different laws. One thing that we've discussed is that the government will be reticent to institute and regulate utilitarian ethics because then it's possible that they will be liable and families could go and sue them for the loss of the driver. Product liability and tort law, again, are state laws, so there's this patchwork of different laws, and I'll talk about the states briefly that have instituted laws so far. But the Department of Transportation has started to make some moves towards saying that the software is under their jurisdiction at the federal level. So Florida, Nevada, DC, and Hawaii have all instituted laws that protect the original equipment manufacturer whose vehicles are converted to autonomous vehicles from liability. So that's actually probably not particularly interesting. It's a very small slice of the sort of issues that we're looking at, but that's been the main legislation so far. Florida has actually had some very interesting politics with Republicans advocating for autonomous vehicles because they see it as a better option than public transportation. And then there's been a growing liberal lobby against autonomous vehicles in Florida because they see it as taking away options for public transportation. And I could see those politics translating to other states as well. Colorado is the one state that has retained liability for damages with the driver. And then California and Nevada are very interested, particularly with Silicon Valley, in developing regulations that will improve legal certainty for developers. But their legislation so far is focused mostly on storing data from an accident and making sure that there's some sort of easily accessible switch so that the driver can take over at a moment's notice. So some of the kind of wrapping up issues, the safety issues need to be worked out in the pre-competitive state so that all of this is decided up front and it's not a matter of marketing the vehicle necessarily. The second issue is that from a social science perspective, as I'm looking at what kind of research project I'll shape on this issue, I think that the idea of anticipatory governance is very important. So this is an idea of trying to anticipate in a technology's early upfront design phases what some of these social and political and regulatory pitfalls will be, and then communicating with the engineers who are designing the technology to feed that back into the product and into the design. So this includes three methods. One is foresight methods. One is public engagement methods, which is a little bit different than public education, but they go hand in hand. So really bringing in the public to have this discussion and anticipate what their current concerns will be, and then taking that back to the product design phase. And then the third is integrating social scientists, often social science graduate students, into laboratories so that there are humanists working together with engineers on designing these technologies. And then finally, regulation is probably going to be necessary for greater certainty and for avoiding this patchwork of different state laws. So thank you very much.